Well, welcome everybody to Friday on the Ridge. For those who don't know me, which I think just about everybody in the room knows me, I'm Cody H., serve as Director of Education and Museum Operations here at Seminary Ridge Museum. Really appreciate all of your support as we continue this program now into the spring. Today's program, focusing on Fort Sumter, is something that back in 2020 into 2021, I guess this one would have been 2021 for the 160th, I did a Beyond the Ridge video, part of our video series that we kept up during COVID, especially when we weren't able to do as many in-person programs. So we went to varying sites around the battlefield and across Seminary Ridge and other positions related to the Gettysburg campaign. And one that I did that spring of 2021 was at the Abner Doubleday Monument. So there's your first mention of Doubleday. I'm going to mention him. Somebody want to keep a counter of how many times I mentioned Abner Doubleday.
Does it count that you said him 5 times right there?
There you go. Sure. Yep, we'll count that. Right. But I was at his statue and talked just relatively briefly about some of these connections that Gettysburg has to the events at Fort Sumter in April 1861. And decided, this is a good time of year, of course, to do a similar program, but in a little bit more depth than I did on that occasion. So I'm just curious. We'll do a little trivia offhand here. I'll give you this clue. There are at least 3 individuals we know by name who were at Gettysburg, who were at Fort Sumter. Right. Anybody know? So we have Doubleday, of course, is the given one. The other 2.
Samuel Wiley Crawford.
Samuel Wiley Crawford. Anybody know the 3rd?
And the other guy.
The other guy, yeah. He's somewhat of a name if you're a Gettysburg aficionado. Think July 2nd and 3rd, Cemetery Ridge. Colonel Norman Hall, commands a brigade in John Gibbon's division, is at Fort Sumter as well. So we have 3 individuals by name we can identify who are actually there on April 12th, 1861, as the 34-hour or so bombardment began. But there are these other really fascinating connections that we have found over the past couple of years as well. And so we're going to talk about some of those connections. That's going to be one piece of what we're going to do. Who was at Fort Sumter? Who was also at Gettysburg? That's one piece. The second that we're going to look at is some of the people who are sort of tangentially related, either biologically related to or ceremonially related to events that take place both at Fort Sumter and at Gettysburg. We have a couple of those connections. And then the third thing we're going to do, and this is going to sort of be the through line throughout, is how does Gettysburg respond? How do the 2,400 residents who live in this town, their major newspapers, how do they respond to the news that is coming from several hundred miles away in the mouth of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina? So we're not really going to look in any sort of in-depth tactical military detail of what happened at Sumter, but we will look at how is this secession winter, how is this crisis of whether the federal government should resupply the garrison at Sumter, how were these things viewed through these couple of individuals, Doubleday, Crawford, Hall, among them, of these people who would be both there in 1861 and here in 1863. And by here, we can say that at least in the case of 3 individuals, Doubleday as well as 2 Confederate soldiers who were in the seminary hospital, 3 of these people were literally inside the building where we are gathered right now, and were also somehow involved in the fighting that took place at Sumter 163 years ago, next Friday, a week from today. So let's take a look first at the situation that brings about the confrontation at Sumter, initially rhetorically, and then of course militarily. Gettysburg is going to react in a couple of different ways through its newspapers. There are these 2 major papers at that point in time. I've talked about this in many talks, but I don't think it can be overstated that these 2 papers could not have been more further apart politically in the 1860s. The Adams Sentinel on the left-hand side of your screen is the Republican Party-backed paper. It is on the political spectrum more progressive. It's not entirely a full-fledged egalitarian sort of Republican paper. It is a pro-Lincoln paper. It's not really an abolitionist paper, but as the war goes on, it will support, in terms of its editorializing, the Union war effort and the changes in that war effort as the Lincoln administration sees it. So it becomes more of an emancipation-minded paper as the conflict wears on. And on your right-hand side, the Gettysburg Compiler, far more conservative, run by Henry Stall, backed by the Democratic Party. Stall himself, a figure who would get himself into trouble during the Battle of Gettysburg, would be arrested on charges of being treasonous, of conspiring with Confederate soldiers who were here in this town. So these are the two major newspapers that, on the brink of civil war, as the election of 1860 plays out, these are the two papers that are responding to these sorts of things. So here we have their headlines right after the election of 1860. That election takes place on November 6th, and the results are printed in the papers that followed, of course. These are weekly papers at that point in time, which is why you might notice that the compiler's edition isn't published until November 12th, almost a week after the election. It's because this is both of these are weekly papers at that point in time. But the Lincoln-Hamlin ticket, Abraham Lincoln, Hannibal Hamlin on the Republican ticket, wins, of course, the election overall, and likewise wins in Gettysburg. Gettysburg's residents will cast 722 votes. The so-called Reading ticket, which was this sort of convoluted Democratic Party-backed plan that had been embraced in Berks County and Reading, Pennsylvania, that they would back whoever won more votes on the Democratic side, because the Democratic Party is split between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. That ticket wins 44% of the vote. The straight Douglas ticket, which is Stephen Douglas, who was the Northern Democratic candidate, wins just 0.6% of the vote. A whole 4 votes will be cast for Stephen Douglas in Gettysburg. The Bell Everett ticket, and that is Edward Everett, who will be at Gettysburg, of course, in November 1863, as the vice presidential candidate on this occasion, will speak here at the dedication of Soldiers National Cemetery about 3 years later. That ticket gets a whopping 10 votes, 1.4% of the vote. But the Lincoln-Hamlin ticket gets 393 votes, about 54% of the vote. So Lincoln, not overtly popular, but victorious, obtains a victory here in Gettysburg. Now, nationally, the Gettysburg papers, as well as some of the national papers, here you can see images that are printed in Harper's Weekly throughout the winter of 1860 into 1861. I think that these come from January, if I'm not mistaken, January 12th, 1861, drawn by some of the U.S. Army soldiers who were at the garrison on the left side at Fort Moultrie, on the right side at Fort Sumter. And sort of lingering in the background of the election and its aftermath, local papers all the way to national papers, small communities all the way to large cities, they are focusing on these events. There's this question, now that there is going to be this rising pro-South, anti-federal government sentiment rising up in the states that eventually become the Confederacy. The lightning rod, the big third rail of politics and social society that winter is, what do you do about the situation at Charleston Harbor, South Carolina? The federal government has started to consolidate where it is keeping these military installations. And ultimately, they will abandon some of them in these states that have this secessionist vigor and rhetoric. But there will be a couple of places in particular that become sort of the symbolic locations that'll be debated over. How do we resupply them? Do we resupply them? Do we take more men to them? Do we take men away from them? And in Charleston Harbor, there are 3 locations that will initially fit that. Castle Pinckney, Fort Moultrie, and of course, Fort Sumter. Men will start moving from Moultrie to Sumter just after Christmas. And so here's an image in Harper's Weekly as well, where we can see the garrison is moving from the smaller Moultrie over to the larger Sumter. But important to note, Fort Sumter is not physically complete. And that is going to be something that plays into the writings of some of the men who were there. They think they're being moved to an absolutely unsafe position, not just because they're surrounded by secessionists who may at any moment fire on the fort or try to take the fort, but the simple fact that the brick is crumbling, that the mortar is not entirely intact, that the parapets are easily overrun, even, as one of them predicts, if a body of just a few dozen men would attack the fort, it could be easily taken in a moment's notice. And so at this point in time, we have President-elect Lincoln, had of course been victorious in that election. That lame duck period is not as short as it is today. from November to mid-January. At that point in time, it's about 6 weeks longer. It won't be until March 4th that Lincoln is going to ultimately assume the presidency. And so there's this period where the guys who are inside of Fort Sumter and the people who are in places like Gettysburg, writing from their small newspapers from afar, they're questioning whether James Buchanan, as the outgoing president, is even, not only is he going to do the right thing, but is he going to do anything? Is he even considering the fate of these men at Sumter? Is he even considering what could happen to the nation if this small body of about 85 soldiers should be fired upon at any moment? He seems to be thinking too small, a lot of people are going to say at that point in time. So Lincoln, sort of behind the scenes, is going to sort of begin setting himself up. He's going to start corresponding with some of these individuals who were at Sumter. And he's going to start taking some of that information and sending it to people who are already in elected office. So, for instance, he sends a message to Illinois Congressman Elihu Washburn the day after South Carolina declared secession. Declared secession December 20th, 1860. Lincoln sends a note December 21st. Last night I received your letter giving an account of your interview with General Scott. This, of course, referring to Winfield Scott, the War of 1812 veteran, the Mexican-American War veteran. He's aging, he's overweight. A lot of people are concerned about his physical well-being. Can he comfortably or ably ride a horse, let alone command all of the armies of the United States? But he is still in command at this point in time. Lincoln thanks Congressman Washburn for sending along this communication with General Scott. And Lincoln says, please present my respects to the general and tell him confidently I shall be obliged to him to be as well prepared as he can to either hold or retake the forts as the case may require at and after the inauguration. Lincoln is already looking at the fact that more than 3 months away, when he assumes the presidency, this is his number one concern. What situation am I walking into at these forts? So we're going to see that nationally the rhetoric now starts to shift in that direction to try to prepare the country for what will Lincoln do to support these men who are inside these installations, especially now that they are almost all moved over to Fort Sumter. One of the most fiery pieces of rhetoric that I could find, and as best I can tell, I haven't seen any other historians use this line, but I was looking through the minutes of the Congressional Globe, which was the location that all of the congressional debates on the floor of the House and the Senate are recorded. And the day before Lincoln's inauguration, so now we're on March 3rd, 1860, from Lincoln's adopted home state, Illinois, Senator Lyman Trumbull tells the Senate this, and I don't think there's anybody who better encapsulates why what's happening at Sumter ultimately becomes important. He says, all that has been done without any effort on the part of the government to protect public property. In other words, government property like forts. This is the reason that secession has made the headway that it has. Let me ask, is it that the United States today has possession of Fort Sumter? Can you tell me why is Fort Sumter in possession of the United States? Because there are 100 soldiers in it for no other reason. Why is Fort Moultrie in possession of the insurgents? Now that U.S. forces have moved out of nearby Fort Moultrie, these, I won't call them quite Confederate forces yet, I guess officially, but secessionist forces have moved right in to that installation that U.S. troops had just left. He says, because there are no men there to protect it. And it is now a matter of history that had the executive done his duty, meaning James Buchanan, and placed 100 men in Fort Moultrie, 100 in Castle Pinckney, and 100 in Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor today would have been open. Will it be said that Carolina would have attacked those forts thus garrisoned? She does not attack 100 men in Fort Sumter. It is a wonder that she has not. The little feeble garrison there is well calculated to invite attack. But this thing of secession, under the policy of the Buchanan administration, has been made a holiday affair in the South. This great government, one of the most powerful on the face of the globe, is falling to pieces just from its own imbecility. And so now we have, for the first time, somebody really voicing emphatically in the halls of Congress on behalf of those men who are inside that garrison. He's saying that this could literally lead to war. They have immediately taken any of the other locations that we have abandoned. The only place they have not taken is the one that we've not yet abandoned. We can't abandon it, essentially, is what he's saying. And then Lincoln, of course, in his first inaugural address the next day, March 4th, 1861, would famously say, "There needs to be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. The power confided to me will be used to occupy, hold, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere." And he, at the end of that speech, famously says, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." Lincoln is taking this hands-off approach of, we're going to do with our federal installations what needs to be done to benefit the garrisons stationed therein. We're not looking for war when we send anything in that direction. You will have to fire on us if you want there to be war. And of course, we can see both sides of Lincoln is trying to say, yeah, we're not looking for a fight at all, but totally understanding he must have that this could be potentially encouraging one inadvertently. So that just gives us that context of what is happening at Sumter. Now, these are all headlines that are printed in the Adams Sentinel and the Gettysburg Compiler. This could have been said for any number of small towns throughout the United States. Gettysburg, of course, just becomes particularly noteworthy because A, we're here, and B, because of what happens here a couple of years later. That what is happening at Sumter, and I'll make this point probably a couple of times, what is happening at Sumter ignites the war that gives Gettysburg its fame. This is going to be what is reported at that point in time. Now, a lot of these headlines and a lot of the pieces that are under them are syndicated from larger papers. It's not like Gettysburg papers have sent a correspondent to Charleston. But they are keeping a close eye on other major newspapers in the likes of Washington and New York. And they are also keeping an eye on any sort of dispatches from the federal military that are making their way into the public sphere. And the downfall of that, of course, is the fact that there are a lot of rumors and a lot of inaccuracies that are spread. So just to give you a sense, if you were living in Gettysburg in early 1861, here are some of the reports you would have heard. The Adams Sentinel reports in late February, when South Carolina attempts to strike down the flag that waves over Sumter, she may depend on encountering a stronger force than could be smuggled to the aid of Major Anderson. So they're saying, you let the fort go, you're going to see probably the full might of what these secessionists intend to do. It's a classic case of they may not be the majority, but they're certainly more vocal than the majority. And so they do truly fear, does the Adams Sentinel in this editorial, what would happen if we abandon that fort. Sentinel will then say again in mid-March, our dispatches from Washington give a number of rumors in relation to the action of the government in reference to Sumter. The general impression is that the troops will be withdrawn, but the report is without authority. This is about a month before the firing on Sumter. Their understanding, troops are going to be pulled out. At that point, of course, that's not yet the case. The compiler will say a few days later, we can see that they're making this now into this heavily politicized affair. The Republicans are racking their ingenuity to discover excuses for the evacuation of Sumter. The gallant Anderson, this of course being Robert Anderson, who was in command of the garrison at that point in time, who was petted and applauded as a marvelous hero, is suddenly discovered to be a traitor. This is a tongue-in-cheek remark, but it is sort of ironic because Henry Stahl, the man who wrote that, the editor of the compiler, is himself charged for being a traitor a couple of years later. The compiler will add a week later, some of the rabid abolition Republicans seem disposed to regard Lincoln's withdrawal of the U.S. troops from Sumter as leading in the footsteps of Buchanan and consequently denounce it. This is a case, we still see this sometimes today. Somebody belongs to one political party, they denounce the other political party for some specific action or some specific phrase, and then when someone of their own party uses that exact same action or phrase, then they don't denounce it, they applaud it. And finally, just 2 weeks before the firing on Sumter, the Adams Sentinel says Fort Sumter has not been evacuated at our last accounts, but it was confidently asserted that the order had been issued by the president to do so, and the evacuation probably took place yesterday. And so we can see all sorts of opinions, all sorts of inaccurate as well as accurate information being disseminated. But you can see how hundreds of miles away, not directly impacting the people of Gettysburg, but they are clearly concerned because of what the national consequences for that small fort in the mouth of Charleston Harbor could mean. Lincoln will send to his cabinet members about a week before this image is published in Harper's Weekly. He sends his cabinet members this: assuming it to be possible to now provision Fort Sumter under all circumstances, is it wise to attempt it? They're running out of food, they're running out of munitions, or not really munitions, they're not using munitions, but they're running out of accoutrements. They especially need food. They need to be just given the basic supplies of living inside the walls of the fort. And it really is kind of a mixed bag in terms of the response that Lincoln gets. The most surprising to him is going to end up, as best we can tell, with sort of a brawl of sorts, at least a rhetorical one, between him and his, up to that point, rather trusted but sort of contentious Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward had apparently secretly started telling some of the emissaries in the South, in South Carolina, we are going to pull these forces out of Fort Sumter. And Lincoln learns this. He also is sort of surprised that Winfield Scott, commander of all U.S. Army, seems to be in favor of pulling men out of the forts. Lincoln himself is not yet quite in favor of doing that. He didn't know what message that would send. But in that same issue of Harper's Weekly, the American people are going to get a look at the 9 faces here of the officers who are in charge of the garrison at Sumter, and enter into our conversation 2 of the individuals who would ultimately be here at Gettysburg. So down here we have Samuel Wiley Crawford and Abner Doubleday at the bottom left-hand side. Respectively at that point in time, Crawford is the assistant surgeon. He has a medical background. And Crawford is a relatively local figure for those who might be unaware. He's from Franklin County, just over the mountain. So he's the assistant surgeon at Sumter. And Doubleday at the bottom left serving as a captain, is second in command to Major Robert Anderson, pictured the left center there in the bottom row. And so for the first time, the American people are going to see this now relatively famous image of the guys who are commanding these 85 men who are inside the walls of Fort Sumter. Now, Doubleday, of course, the most famous figure who is both at Sumter and at Gettysburg, and who has multiple distinctions at both of these locations for his actions. He's 41 years old at the time of the firing on Fort Sumter. He had served after graduating from West Point in 1842 in the 1st United States Artillery. And so, like so many people of this generation before the Civil War, background in engineering, background in artillery. In his eyes, as Doubleday would later write, secessionists urge that the North should be more than ever subservient to the South, more active in catching fugitive slaves, and more careful not to speak against the institution of slavery. And he has firsthand experience. He hears this from the people of Charleston. The officers of the U.S. Army, before the actual secession of South Carolina, when they would go into the city of Charleston itself, out of the fort, they're relatively welcome. There are these accounts of them being at dinners with local Charlestonians and community leaders. They can hear, however, some of these debates before everything becomes real. It's just sort of like political debates. Those may be sort of awkward, situations at a family gathering sort of thing when somebody differs entirely from everybody else at the table, that kind of thing, is sort of the sense we can get from Doubleday. But as the winter wears on, he starts to become concerned in his writings with what would happen to the enslaved or formerly enslaved who were in the area. He starts to become extraordinarily concerned with his own well-being and with the well-being of those who are directly around him. But he says, after the actual fighting began at Fort Sumter, that in hindsight, he was proud that the U.S. troops at Sumter were, in his words, virtually warring against slavery. But those debates were not only between the people of Charleston and the soldiers of the U.S. Army. They were also inside the walls of the fort itself. Doubleday quickly realizes that he's probably the most progressive person there in terms of race, in terms of how he wanted to deal with the matters of of Abraham Lincoln opposing the expansion of slavery. And so Doubleday describes himself as the only quote-unquote black Republican in the fort. He strikes up arguments with Robert Anderson, the commander of the garrison. He disputes his opinion that, in his words, slavery was right in principle and expressly sanctioned by the Bible. Anderson's words there. Doubleday and Anderson start into this debate that we can see play out on the second floor of our museum, using the Bible for and against slavery. And so we see these spirited debates amongst the people of Sumter. Now that's what Doubleday tells us publicly in his post-war writings. We'll look in a moment here at his personal writings in that winter of 1860 and 1861, at what he's saying privately to his brother Ulysses, who works at a bank in New York City. So there's this wonderful series of letters that you can find at loc.gov, the Library of Congress website, in which we can see this private correspondence that Doubleday is sending to his brother about the situation at Fort Sumter before it's fired upon. And he's much more candid, as we would expect in this private correspondence, than in his post-war writings. Now, Ulysses in his own right is a rather fascinating figure. I never knew his story until recently, but he's Abner Doubleday's younger brother. As I mentioned, he's a banker in New York City at the Bank of North America. But he would, shortly thereafter, after the war begins, serve as Doubleday's aide-de-camp. He then becomes commander of the 4th New York Heavy Artillery. He's situated in the District of Florida in command of an artillery brigade. And then he becomes a lieutenant colonel of the 3rd United States Colored Infantry and the commanding officer and colonel of the 45th United States Colored Infantry. And then he commands brigades of United States colored troops toward the end of the war. Is at Appomattox Courthouse, surrounding Lee's army at the end of the war, transferred ultimately to Texas, but a fascinating figure in his own right. But he's going to start receiving this correspondence from Doubleday while Doubleday is at the garrison at Fort Sumter. A couple of examples here. This is September 1860s. We're going to back ourselves up a little bit. We're going to kind of have that yo-yo effect. We'll go sort of chronological, sort of not, in talking about these people. But Doubleday tells his brother, "Secession with everyone I meet seems to be a foregone conclusion. They all say, as a matter of course, they must have the forts if they secede, and that they do not appear to think of attacking us." So 6 months before they attack, they're saying, "We won't attack you." He had on good word from U.S. officials, both elected and military, that in Doubleday's words, there would be no fighting, that the administration would withdraw the troops in the harbor and give up the forts to the south if secession took place. He then starts to hear, as I mentioned a little bit ago, there are these differing rumors as to why they're staying at Fort Sumter. They think it's because there's this fear of what if these people secede? We have to defend the federal installation. But then they start to hear that the Buchanan administration is saying there may be some foreign threats. There may be some international threats. Mexico is thrown into the fray, even France and Britain, and these stories that these men are trying to make sense of what sort of international affairs are we potentially being drawn into here. And he starts to express some distrust, not only to the people of South Carolina, but to the Buchanan administration as well. Abner Doubleday says, "I do not believe the administration has the right to give up 1 foot of U.S. soil to the state of South Carolina." And he also expresses distrust in the man who preceded Robert Anderson in command of Moultrie and Sumter, Lieutenant Colonel John Gardner. Doubleday expresses that there's another major issue that fall, what he calls a great quantity of broken bone fever. There's this little outbreak of sickness that is now devolving upon the men who are, essentially on their own man-made island inside the walls of this fort. He sends another letter a couple of days later. He sort of talks a little bit more detail about that distrust. He said, I did trust them when I got here. I need to tell you that if you're passing these along to anybody, I believed in my government. But I don't know if I do any longer, and I anxiously am awaiting. I hope that Abraham Lincoln is elected president, because I don't know what will happen if he's not. It appears to me, says Abner Doubleday, if government really intended to act upon secessionist troops, they would have sent them from all points. And he starts listing locations that he knows there are vast garrisons of troops in the north that are not necessary to be kept there. And that if the federal government really wanted to protect these men, they would send them by the hundreds. But instead, they get 40 new recruits about this point in time. He looks back in history and he says, when General Scott was here in South Carolina, there were 1,000 men. Now we have 85 or so. He's deeply concerned over the physical condition of the fort. It's literally falling apart. As I alluded to a bit ago, he and others are concerned that if they were attacked, they could be easily overrun, just given the fact that there's almost nothing to this supposed bastion. And in the most fiery line of this particular letter, or of any of his letters, he says, the truth is, after the sand is all cleared away, the mortar between the bricks replaced, and the bastionets built, the fort will no longer need a garrison adequate in numbers to defend it. Under no circumstances am I in favor of giving it up without fighting. If no one else stands by me, I will go it alone. And ultimately, he will be the first person who fires a shot in anger out of Fort Sumter toward Confederate forces, a man of his word, if nothing else. He realized, and he starts telling his brother as well, and these letters are, like I said, free to access if you want to read more. This second one is particularly long. I won't get into it all. But he starts telling his brother, like, I'm concerned. I'm second in command at this fort. And I don't really trust my first in command. He doesn't tell us that in his post-war writings in such detail. He tells us about those debates that he was having over the merits of anti-slavery rhetoric, etc. But we can see in his private correspondence, he literally thinks that the garrison may be in command of a potential traitor, and especially in the form of Anderson, a loyal man, but Doubleday questions. He's from this state of Kentucky. Will Kentucky secede? What if Kentucky secedes? Does he go with it? If he goes with it, what happens to the rest of the garrison here at Sumter? And he says, if that happens, then I'm the man in command, and all of this could fall upon my shoulders. It's really fascinating to get a sense into his mindset. Well, with these letters, Ulysses Doubleday is going to start to forward them to prominent individuals. And by prominent, he sends this map that Doubleday apparently drew, or he did draw, not to say apparently, we have his signature at the bottom of it. He sends this map that Doubleday drew from the fort, as well as both of the letters that I just quoted from to Abraham Lincoln. We don't have a response from Lincoln, but it appears that he did receive them as best we can tell. He starts sending notes to Lincoln's private secretary, John Nicolay. And inside of these, Ulysses Doubleday will explain, I send you these letters not because it is more your business than mine to try and save the country from disgrace, but because the almost certainty of your election may give you the means of information and influence which may avail you to prevent it. Your success is simply a convenient pretext, for the desire to secede, my brother writes, has always been rampant in Charleston. I enclose you a map of his making, showing what would happen if the forts once pass into the hands of the traitors. So he calls out Charlestonians as traitors, and he even goes so far in his letter to John Nicolay, Lincoln's secretary, as to say, I am writing to you to expose Mr. Buchanan's treason. He outright says the sitting president, the outgoing president in this lame duck period, he says, I think he may be guilty of treason. He says, I praise the superintending of the fort, but admit of Abner, I think he is afraid. And so here we can see that private correspondence amongst brothers is a fascinating insight. Well, of course, the fort is fired upon. Doubleday had explained the condition of the garrison in a letter to Lincoln on January 15th, just a couple of months before. I mentioned that number 85 is typically thrown around. He gives us these numbers. He says the condition of the garrison is this. They number 60 men, soldiers, and 11 musicians. They have only hard bread, pork, and beans enough to last with economy for 4 months. They have no coal nor any other fuel except parts of some old buildings, enough to last about 40 days. The men and officers are worn out with watching and work. And so we always hear that, they were getting desperate, that the fort needed to be resupplied. These are the sorts of conditions that are being passed along to Lincoln in private correspondence. We can see that there are these accounts of literally the number of buildings that are around Fort Sumter. They're starting to tear down buildings because they need the wood to burn it, to use as fuel. Because as he says, they don't have any coal. We have 11 musicians, but we're in more need of soldiers, who can fire artillery, things like that. And at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, after attempts to resupply the garrison, after the infamous Star of the West incident in which a ship is going out to resupply the fort, and it's fired upon, some say in January 1861. That's the technical beginning of the Civil War. But the first really formal shots will ring out at 4:30 a.m. at about dawn, April 12th, 1861. Doubleday would describe 19 South Carolina batteries hammering Sumter throughout 34 hours of bombardment. As in his words, the firing burst forth in one continuous roar, and large patches of both the exterior and interior masonry began to crumble and fall in all directions. Doubleday says, "My company was told off in 3 details for firing purposes. As I was the ranking officer, I took the first detachment, loaded a round, and fired. The first shot bounded off the sloping roof of the battery opposite, without producing any apparent effect." And then he brings meaning to what he had just done. He writes this in 1876. "In aiming the first gun fired against the rebellion, I had no feeling of self-reproach, for I fully believed the contest was inevitable, and was not of our seeking. The United States was called upon not only to defend its sovereignty, but its right to exist as a nation. The only alternative was to submit to a powerful oligarchy who was determined to make freedom forever subordinate to slavery." Now, there's a little bit of that, he knows what happened ultimately. He knows that this was the war that ended slavery, because he's writing this 11 years after the conclusion of the conflict. But because we have some of that private correspondence where Doubleday says, "I'm willing to fire if need be. I'm willing to be the only man here to fire if need be." And the fact that he said that privately before these events actually played out, and then he is the man who takes it upon himself to fire the first shot, I think is a pretty remarkable sort of historical caveat that we see there. Now, of course, up to the time of Gettysburg, Doubleday is going to continue to raise through the ranks, not just as that captain turned major who was at Sumter, but earning commendations, right, making his way through the ranks, in command of a division at Antietam, and eventually in command of a corps. When he enters Gettysburg July 1st, 1863, we always say the first corps is commanded by Major General John Reynolds, but in de facto, it is being commanded by Doubleday. And that, of course, is really cemented by Reynolds' death, just 800 yards to your left outside of these walls. But as the day wears on July 1st, 1863, Doubleday is going to not only be in command of the western side of the battlefield for the United States First Corps, but he's going to have a direct relation to the inside of this building. And as a side note, that image on your left-hand side, you can see that at the bottom of it, this is an image of General Doubleday after he's been promoted. But it says there, Doubleday, who fired the first, I can't quite read it there, who fired the first gun with the determination that traitors to the stars and stripes must and shall be taken down, trodden, if need be, into dust. So whoever wrote on this had strong feeling, strong sentiment, of course, in terms of what Doubleday had done at Sumter, and that would continue to be perhaps his most famous point until his unceremonious leaving the service after what happens here at Gettysburg. But we'll see him on the western side of this building, just outside of these walls, ordering the construction of that famous barricade of rails, that semicircular creation of U.S. First Corps soldiers, the taking down of limbs and branches and digging up of stumps and piling up of earth to protect these Union troops against the final Confederate attack on July 1st, 1863. And Doubleday, in the longest official report of any participant in the Battle of Gettysburg, will go on in extensive detail about his role at the seminary, saying that they had fallen back to the entrenchments in front of the seminary, which I had directed to be thrown up as a precautionary measure to assist in holding the new position. Then he talks about the defense of that barricade right outside these walls. From behind the feeble barricade of rails, brave men stemmed the fierce tide which pressed upon them incessantly, and held the rebel lines which encircled them on 3 sides at bay until the greater portion of the corps had retired. He would say in his testimony to the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, March 1st, 1864, talk about, again, the feeble pile of rails around the seminary. But he gives us a couple of pieces of information that I think are far too often overlooked in terms of how he used not only the seminary campus, but the seminary building. In his official report, he says, during the retreat from Seminary Ridge, I remained at the seminary superintending the final movement until thousands of hostile bayonets made their appearance around the sides of the building. Now, at the seminary, I think is a vague enough term. We would assume he means on the seminary campus somewhere. And when you look at the headquarters marker that is today out on McPherson Ridge, you can see at the bottom of it, it's hard to see there, but it says that Doubleday's headquarters were, I think I have it quoted here, I do not, 230 yards southeast from here near the pike. Well, Doubleday, in his Joint Committee in the Conduct of War, tells us, no, I'm not going to do that, tells us specifically where those headquarters were. He says that during the retreat, I threw my personal guard of 40 men around and into the seminary building and fought a whole brigade for 20 minutes. I remained at the seminary until I thought everything had been got off and was the last to leave. And so perhaps there's a little bit of poetry to this, I think, that here's the man who fired the first shot at Fort Sumter, at this brick installation that opened the American Civil War. And here he is on really his final day in command of troops on the field. Whole host of reasons that we won't go into here. Some of you know the story, of course. Doubleday is relieved of command for others not thinking that he did his job responsibly on July 1st. And John Newton is brought over from the 6th Corps to take Doubleday's place. And Doubleday will be effectively pushed out of the Army of the Potomac from this point forward. But we can see his American Civil War service as a commander begins with firing the first shot at Fort Sumter and the crumbling walls of that installation. And it will effectively end on his final major day of being in command of the First Corps, in holding, at least for some amount of time, this other private, not military installation, but another brick structure here on the bloodiest battlefield of the Civil War. So I think there's some interesting historical parallels there. Now, I won't go into as much detail on others who were there, but wanted really to emphasize Doubleday because of his connection here, as well as the fact that he wrote a lot more than some of these others did, as best I can tell. But Dr. Samuel Crawford, that left image is from that Harper's Weekly image we looked at a bit ago, that collection of 9 officers who were at Fort Sumter. He's serving as the assistant surgeon at Sumter, first at Moultrie, then at Fort Sumter. He had entered his duties in December 1860, and his predecessor dies of yellow fever outbreak. I don't know the exact date on that, and the thought hadn't really occurred until I was setting up here that I wonder if there's any correlation between his death and the fact that Doubleday mentioned that there was this outbreak of bone break fever, I think as he phrased it, in September. So whatever sickness might have spread through the fort perhaps had a role in putting Samuel Crawford in the position that he ultimately was. He said this in his book, written a couple of decades later: as the medical officer of Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter, I was brought into close relations with Major Anderson and was a part of the beginning and end of our first combat with secession at Sumter. I saw the first and last shot sent against that fort that aroused the country to war. And the fort will undergo 34 hours of bombardment. It will eventually fall, of course. And he would say this of April 15th, when they're in the process of leaving the fort and now it being in Confederate hands. Crawford says, by Anderson's orders, the men were formed upon the parade ground and marched out under Doubleday with their flags, the drums beating the national air. A large crowd had collected on vessels and steamers and in boats, and had surrounded the fort to witness its evacuation. Great enthusiasm prevailed as the command embarked upon the board that was to convey them to the steamer. So they're leaving these on these smaller ships to be taken collectively to a larger one. Crawford says, as the surgeon of the fort remaining until the last, I was in attendance upon the mortally wounded man who had expired. And he gives us a full casualty list on April 18th. He files his casualty list. It's ironic that it's a relatively bloodless affair when we look at how bloody this war would ultimately become. But it's not entirely bloodless. There are men who are wounded, and as he mentioned, there is a man who did die. There is a fatality of the fighting at Fort Sumter. And knowing what we know now, that there were 620,000 plus fatalities that come as a result of this 4-year war, they didn't know at this point that was going to happen. There are calls up until the summer, of course, that, as a congressman famously says, we'll probably be able to wipe up the amount of blood shed in this war with a single handkerchief. That's the mindset of people at that point in time. And so to have an incident like played out at Sumter, it's a pretty major event. For an army of 16,000 men who had never had to treat very many wounds as a result of battle in at least a couple of decades on a major scale, this is a pretty severe incident. And you can see some of the categories that he gives us there. 4 men wounded on April 12th, 2 severely, 2 slightly. 1 man had been killed on April 14th while firing a salute. That was Private Daniel Huff, Company E, 1st U.S. Artillery. 4 men had been wounded on April 14th, 1 mortally, Edward Galway, who died on April 19th. 1 was severely burned on his thigh and leg, 1 severely wounded, 2 slightly wounded, including 1 man who had been struck by fire to the face. So we can see this is the casualty report. I think oftentimes overlooked. We think of, I think there's a horse who's killed at Sumter, and there are men who are maimed and killed there. Now, throughout the course of the war that would follow, much like Doubleday, Crawford would rise to the rank of Major General, most famously here at Gettysburg, in command of the Division of Pennsylvania Reserves. And that would inspire art, carrying the flag through the Valley of Death, a monument, of course, that is out there today, a relatively recent one, I believe, 1988. But Crawford, a figure who is, like Doubleday, I would say, most famous for having been at Fort Sumter and at Gettysburg, the first and the bloodiest, and he takes an active role in the engagement that takes place here. But Crawford would not be done with his time at Gettysburg. I didn't mention it, but Doubleday would return multiple times. He would come back, he would deliver tours. Anytime that there was a large reunion, 1869, for instance, the first attempt at a blue-gray reunion, Abner Doubleday was typically the veteran who was chosen to give a tour of Seminary Ridge or of this portion of the first day's battlefield. But Crawford will come back on a couple of truly notable occasions. Who's the most famous person in this photo? I'm sure some of you are familiar with this photo. Grant's in here. Yep. So Ulysses S. Grant. The man on the left with the top hat there is John White Geary, former commander in the Union 12th Corps at Gettysburg. By that time, this is June 1867, either the 20th or the 21st. Geary is governor of Pennsylvania. Then I think, it's kind of hard to tell, but I think Crawford is the man next to him then, actually in the doorway here. Then you have Grant, and then you have Horace Porter, who was most famous for having been Grant's aide, writes a wonderful memoir called Campaigning with Grant, giving us some valuable insight into the final 2 years of the war. But they're over on Baltimore Street at the Soldiers' Orphans Home, and you can see several of the orphans gathered around on either side of them. But this is one of those photos you can go, line it up almost perfectly if you go over there across from the tour center today. But Crawford would also invest in Gettysburg. He would purchase land. You can see in the key there at the bottom, it says land owned by General S. Wiley Crawford is the darker red, sort of that big square just west of Little Round Top in the Valley of Death, in the vicinity where the Pennsylvania Reserves were, where he had commanded this division and where his statue stands today. So we had a stake in the ownership of part of the Gettysburg battlefield, surrounded by that preserved land by the GBMA, the Battlefield Memorial Association. Both Doubleday and Crawford would write extensively about their experiences at Fort Sumter, respectively. Doubleday writes his in 1876, the one on the left, Reminiscences of Fort Sumter and Moultrie, and the right-hand side, 1887, Crawford's book, The Genesis of the Civil War, The Story of Sumter. You can find both of these digitized entirely free online. And finally, we have our third and final person we can name who was at Gettysburg as well as had been at Sumter, and that is then Lieutenant Norman Hall. At that point in time, Hall at Fort Sumter is going to be the main individual inside the garrison who is responsible for taking messages in the weeks preceding the firing on the fort of trying to attempt some form of peace negotiation, trying to inform the people of Charleston what the plans were as best he could tell them of bringing things back and forth. He is also then going to be most famous, his involvement at the fort, for that flag that waves above the fort. He also is going to be the person who had communicated with the governor of South Carolina as well, Pickens, Francis Pickens, sends him a flag of truce between him and Anderson to allow for the safe passage. So he's talking to influential individuals. Back to the flag, on April 12, 1861. Crawford would observe of Hall, in the midst of the fire, The flagstaff, having been repeatedly struck, was shot away at 1:30 p.m. and fell heavily to the ground. The flag halyards, the ropes, had been cut, and the flag itself had been sustained by one only, that had become twisted upon the staff. Upon the disappearance of the flag, the enemy slackened his fire. It was at once secured by Lieutenant Hall and attached to a short spar, a pole, brought promptly and carried to the parapet, where it was again raised and the temporary staff secured to a gun carriage on the parapet amid the renewed and concentrated fire of the enemy's guns. So this becomes Hall's claim to fame at Sumter. He's the guy who saved the flag when the parapet was shot away. And there's this wonderful photo that's taken right after the fall of the fort. On the left-hand side, you can see it's written along the border, Sumter after the bombardment, and along the right side here it says flagstaff shot away. You can really clearly see, how dilapidated the flagpole has become. It's splintered at the top. And that flag does still exist today, a National Park Service image there of the flag. We'll talk more about its return to Sumter here in just a moment. Now, Hall would rise to the rank of colonel. He would receive multiple commendations, especially at Fredericksburg, in command of the 7th Michigan Infantry. And then here at Gettysburg, he's in command of a brigade in the 2nd Corps down on Cemetery Ridge. And that would be the most famous piece, I would say, of his military service outside of Sumter. And these are a couple of maps you can see right in the center there. Hall's men on July 2nd, the attack of Ambrose Wright, the Georgians that break through the center of the Federal line. Some would say provides inspiration for Lee to re-attack the center on July 3rd. And here we can see an American Battlefield Trust map. That one on the left is from Hal Jesperson. I typically like to find period maps, so there aren't great period maps that go down to the brigade level. But here we can see Hall's men about to endure that attack on July 3rd from the center of Pickett's division. And as Pickett's men break through the line, we can see the breaking up of Hall and the other brigades around there. But as you can see, he's one of the brigades that rushed to close the breach, as the saying says, as the line says there. But he will unfortunately die then in 1867. He dies of typhoid fever, same fate that befalls so many individuals who fought during the Civil War. Lives only for another couple of years after the conflict had concluded. And then we have that same flag pictured here again when it's re-raised over Fort Sumter. Anybody know the date that occurred? It's a big one. Go ahead.
The day Lincoln was shot.
The day Lincoln was shot, April 14th, 1865. Lincoln receives and responds to, obviously in the negative, an invitation to go. Doesn't do it, stays in Washington to see the end of the war through, and of course is at Ford's Theater the night that these festivities had taken place. Last couple of things that I want to hit on here. How does Gettysburg respond to what happens at Sumter, and what does it mean in the aftermath of the war when veterans are returning and they're starting to see these connections as they look across the broad spectrum of their Civil War service? So again, we see headlines from the Adams Sentinel on the left, the compiler on the right-hand side. This is how the Sentinel would explain this situation. War has begun, and upon the enemies of the government rests the fearful responsibility. Thus the first blow has come from the Confederated government, which is thenceforth our enemy. It becomes us now to defend our firesides and drive back the invaders. Little did they know that would become literal a couple of years later. Patriotism in such a crisis will animate all true bosoms. Pennsylvania is leading off in this work of preparing to prevent anarchy and save the liberties of the people. So the Sentinel's response is a really purely patriotic one. Save the Republic. Organize, do what we have to do to ensure that this doesn't spread. The compiler. Total opposite reaction. Civil war hangs suspended over this country by a single thread. The anti-slavery radicals of the new administration have gained control of it. And the rebels and traitors, put that in quotes, I think they mean it tongue-in-cheek, of the seceded states are to be whipped into submission. It is becoming too evident that, so far as Lincoln's administration possesses the power, the hideous horrors of civil war are to be forced upon the country. The war has in reality commenced at Fort Sumter. It should be the prayer of every American citizen that this unnatural war cease. Would not compromise have been 1,000 times better. God save the country? There's a question mark at the end of that. God save the country? Should he? Will he? So we can see on one hand defend the Republic, fight against the traitors, rhetoric of that sort from the Sentinel. And the compiler puts lines like traitors in quotes because they don't entirely disagree with the sentiments that have been espoused by secessionist types in the South. And this is just the beginning of what will become this war of words between these two papers during the course of the conflict. How about this building? In a total case, I'm not suggesting there's anything correlative here, if that's a word, between these two things, but it's happenstance that on April 16th, 1861, 4 days after the firing on Fort Sumter, the seminary board here at the Lutheran Seminary is going to invest in a repair fund to raise $2,000, which is about $59,000 today, half of which is to be applied to the liquidation of the present debt, the other half to be invested as a permanent fund for repairs. The very week that the Civil War begins, a war that would bring a lot of structural damage to this building, the seminary sets up an insurance policy to fix building repairs. And lo and behold, of course, a couple of years later, there would be extensive battle damage. It would cost the seminary about $2,300, which is about $48,500 today. So they're only off by a couple of thousand of what they ultimately needed. But coincidental that within 4 days of what happens at Sumter, the seminary here is doing this. But there's a much more literal connection between the two. And it takes place on July 1st, 1863, or I guess actually in the days that follow. Jeremiah Hoffman, the wounded soldier pictured there, 142nd Pennsylvania, he writes about in the days that followed as the hospitals started to consolidate at Gettysburg. He says quite a number of the 1st South Carolina were in the room. So here are men of both armies gathered together. At one time, we had a discussion of the merits of the secession question. We debated the matter with less of ill feeling than is sometimes called out by the discussion of political questions in our society debates. They have a civil debate, essentially, he's saying. They gladly accepted one thing, that is that our army had a position at Gettysburg equal to theirs at Fredericksburg. There were 2 men among them who said they had belonged to the U.S. regular army and had deserted from Captain Doubleday's battery at Fort Sumter. 2 Confederate soldiers in the seminary hospital, former soldiers of the U.S. Army who left Fort Sumter when Doubleday was there. I did not at first believe him, says Lieutenant Hoffman, so I questioned them about Doubleday, who was then Major General commanding our division. They gave me a minutely exact description of him and imitated his manner of giving commands and other peculiarities of his so well that I could not help believing that they knew Doubleday. I told them what his rank then was, and that he had fought them on the first day. They were somewhat amused that they could listen to the story of their old commander's defeat. And so here we see in the walls of this building, veterans of Fort Sumter debating the merits of secession, debating the conduct of the Civil War, and getting a little amusement out of the fact that they had just encountered their former commander on the battlefield. Another connection here to the cemetery, Soldiers National Cemetery, that is, as we can see here among the list of people who were on the stage at the cemetery is Charles Anderson, Lieutenant Governor of Ohio. That's the brother of Robert Anderson, who was in command of the garrison at Fort Sumter. And it was he, in what author David Dixon has called the Lost Gettysburg Address, who delivered the speech, or a speech, at the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church the night that Abraham Lincoln is sitting in the same pew as John Burns at the Presbyterian Church. The man whose speech they're listening to, at least in part during this sort of patriotic church service, is the brother of Robert Anderson. So a fascinating little connection there as well. He would become the governor of Ohio in 1865, at that time serving as lieutenant governor. And there's this story of William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, when he's at the dedication of the National Cemetery, and there was the former governor, present governor, and lieutenant governor of, and I think the governor-elect of Ohio are all on the stage there. And I think it's Seward or someone else asks, how many governors does Ohio have? Because there are all these governors there, but he was among that crowd. And then lastly, final point that I want to make is just how did these men respond, and these veterans respond who come back to Gettysburg in the aftermath of the Civil War, when all these monuments are being dedicated in the 30-odd years after the battle, that major era of monumentation. And they heavily emphasize, sort of lingering in the background of many of these speeches, is what had happened at Fort Sumter. They see a direct correlation between the events of April 1861 and July 1863. A couple of examples. James Bowen of the 37th Massachusetts. Here may be said to have been in every sense the central point in the Great War of the Rebellion, meaning Gettysburg. These heights form a vantage ground, so to speak, from which we may look back to the beginning and hear the firing of the first gun at Sumter. Thomas Leeburn of the 68th Pennsylvania. The faces before me are the same young men who laid their schemes of life aside, abandoned careers, and with the spirit of patriots and the devotion of martyrs, offered themselves a willing sacrifice to that country whose startled hills were echoing to the guns of Sumter. C.F. Hall of the 5th New York. The fair structure of our Temple of Liberty could not longer be sustained on the cornerstone of slavery. Then came the signal gun at Sumter, leading us, as he goes on for a paragraph or so, but he says, leading us to this 3 days battlefield, the turning point of Lee's success, and the monuments erected here in honor of the dead of that war. Albert Magnan of the 99th Pennsylvania asks the question, what led to Gettysburg? And he answers, on one bright morning in April 28 years ago, the people of the North were startled by the announcement which flashed over the electric wires. And he goes on for a paragraph explaining how he received the news of what had happened at Sumter and why it inspired him to join the United States Army. And one more example, Harry Wilson of the 81st Pennsylvania. From Fort Sumter, the roar of cannon, like an electric shock, boomed out the story of insult to the country's banner and rebellion to our country's law. How loud, how portentous. No, after cannonading and all the war, not even the 400 guns at Gettysburg pouring out their contents at one time seemed half as loud as the bombardment of Fort Sumter and Anderson's defense. And one man who would be at the dedication of those monuments, but who was also at the rededication of the flag at Fort Sumter. The image on your left is the re-raising of the flag at Sumter. The image on your right is George Meade speaking at the dedication of Soldiers' National Monument in 1869 here at Gettysburg. With the magic of technology, we'll put in another speaker there, that being Henry Ward Beecher, famed Reverend and abolitionist. And I'll end with his words. So after he gives that keynote at the rededication of the flag at Fort Sumter in 1865, the day Lincoln was assassinated, July 1st, 1869, he offers the opening prayer at the dedication of Soldiers' National Monument. And in this prayer he says, when evil rushed in upon us like a flood, thou didst at last raise up opposition. And when aggression broke forth in battle, O Lord, God of our fathers, did call forth multitudes innumerable, who stood especially to defend this nation and maintain its integrity unimpaired. Here upon this eminence we beseech thee, O God, to grant blessing upon the nation. Be pleased to unite together the hearts of the once divided but now united people. Unite their hearts together, and with new foundations of liberty, universal intelligence, and liberty and virtue and purity, may this union grow stronger than it was or could have been. And so we can see these multiple ways in which we can connect directly the people who were at that beginning, opening actions of the American Civil War, and were here at this bloodiest battlefield of the war, to go, as I said earlier, from those crumbling walls of Sumter, ultimately to the crumbling walls of the building in which we are gathered right now and the fields that surround it.